Welcome to Twilight Fables, where the fairy tales you thought you knew decay into something far more haunting. Tonight's tale is one of erasure, guilt, and a tree that blooms with what we forget. This is a dark retelling of Juniper Tree. The wind was sharp that autumn. It came through the bones of the house like something searching, not playful or crisp, but thin and pointed, the kind that made doors unlatch themselves and floors whimper at night. It came especially strong from the north, through the long dead garden behind the house, across the small patch of earth beneath the tall stone wall, and over the hill where a single tree now stood. The juniper tree, tall with a thin black trunk and a sweep of bristled green. It hadn't been there long. In fact, no one in the village remembered it being planted. It had simply arrived, as if the earth had cracked open to make room, and in the house that leaned with age and secrets, something had been forgotten. Once, the house had been filled with sound, the giggle of a child, the scrape of toy wheels on wood, the creak of a swing hooked to the old pear tree. There had been drawings on the kitchen wall, finger marks on the window panes, and muddy shoes by the door, always one pair smaller than the others. But those sounds had gone quiet. The drawings faded, the muddy shoes were gone, and no one could quite say why, not even the father. "Funny," said Mr. Grenshaw one morning, scratching his beard and peering into the hearth. "It feels too quiet lately." His wife, Marlene, looked up from her knitting. She was a handsome woman, sharp-featured and clean, always smelling of lavender oil and ash. "It's autumn," she said evenly. "Things settle down." He frowned. I know, but it's more than that. Like we're missing something." Marlene didn't answer. She set down the knitting needles and stood to fetch the kettle. The fire popped sharply, casting shadows along the walls. The smell of iron and forgotten milk filled the room. The man rubbed his forehead. "Didn't we used to have a swing in the yard?" Marlene turned just slightly. "No," she said, "we never did." He stared into the flames. The swing was in his mind, but distant. He could almost see it, wooden, painted yellow, with two fraying ropes tied to the pear tree's branch. The image drifted like something from a dream. Then it began to fade. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows. The tree out back shivered. Their daughter, Lottie, was the only one who saw the truth at first. She was 6 years old, quiet, and unnaturally pale. She spent most days sitting in the sunroom with a box of worn crayons, drawing pictures on butcher's paper. Her favourite colour was grey-blue, and she always drew faces with too many eyes, or too few. That morning, she'd drawn something new, a picture of a boy with no eyes at all, just a round head, brown hair, and a black mouth that was open like it was screaming. Marlene frowned when she saw it. "Who's that meant to be?" Lottie didn't answer. "Is it Papa?" Lottie shook her head. "A friend from town?" "No." Marlene's mouth twitched. She walked to the table and picked up the paper, examining the figure more closely. Her stomach turned as she noticed something else. The boy had no name written above it. All her daughter's drawings were labelled Mama, Papa, Lottie, Bird, House. But this one was just boy. Marlene crumpled the drawing. Don't draw things like that. Lottie didn't cry. She only looked at the window behind her mother. The juniper tree swayed without wind. He sings at night, she whispered. I think he wants to come in. Marlene turned sharply. That's enough. That night, the wind came back, stronger than before. The windows rattled in their frames. The chimney howled. Somewhere deep inside the walls, an old music box played 2 tinny notes and then stopped. Mr. Grenshaw woke in a cold sweat. His dreams had been strange. He'd seen a child standing in the hallway, barefoot, covered in dirt. The child had been whispering something, but no sound had come out, only the movement of lips. He turned to Marlene, who was still sleeping, one arm clutching the edge of the blanket. For a moment, he lay there, heart pounding. He could feel something missing, like the word stuck just before the tongue, like forgetting your own name. Then he sat up. Did we ever have a... He paused. Had a what? The thought was gone. In the kitchen, the kettle had boiled dry. A streak of black soot curled up the wall above the stove. And in the backyard, the juniper tree had grown 3 inches taller overnight. Beneath its roots, something old and forgotten shifted in the dirt. Marlene swept the kitchen the next morning. The broom scraped against the boards, stirring up flecks of dust and dried leaves. She moved methodically, her jaw tight, her steps even. She paused by the back door, staring out at the garden. The juniper tree was blooming now. Clusters of berries, blue as bruises, hung from its branches. She stared at them for a long time. The swing was there. It swayed slowly in the still air, though no one had touched it. Yellow painted wood, knotted ropes, old, worn. She blinked, then it was gone. At lunch, Lottie refused to eat. I'm not hungry, she said, pushing her plate away. Marlene raised an eyebrow. We don't waste food. There's something in the stew, Lottie whispered. It's beef. No, something else. It tastes like forgetting. Marlene slapped the table. Enough with your nonsense. But the girl didn't flinch. She turned and stared at the corner of the room, where a small pair of muddy shoes sat, half covered by a fraying rug. Marlene followed her gaze. There were no shoes there. The next day, the mailman stopped by. He handed Marlene a single envelope. No return address, just a plain piece of parchment. Inside was a photograph, black and white, faded. A family of 4 stood in front of the pear tree. The man, Mr. Grenshaw, looked younger. The woman, Marlene, was smiling stiffly. Beside them stood Lottie, wearing a pinafore dress, and beside her, a boy, 7, maybe 8, brown-haired, holding a wooden toy horse in one hand and a bundle of juniper berries in the other. No name was written on the back. Marlene stared at the photo for a long time. Her hands began to tremble. She burned it in the hearth before her husband could see. But that night, the wind returned stronger than ever, and in the back garden, the juniper tree began to hum. Lottie had another drawing the next day. This time, it was the same boy, but his mouth was sewn shut, and from his chest grew roots that wrapped around the trunk of a tree. She didn't look up when Marlene entered the room. "His name's almost gone," she said, "but not all the way. He remembers us." Marlene snatched the paper from her and tore it in two. But when she turned, she saw something that froze her heart. There, on the windowsill, sat a single juniper berry, blue and pulsing slightly, as if it had just been plucked. That night, the house groaned in its sleep. Lottie whispered things in the dark, and the floorboards clicked back in reply. Mr. Grenshaw dreamed of a swing creaking beneath the weight of no one, and Marlene stood by the window, watching the tree in the yard. Its branches stretched wide, almost like arms. The wind whispered something she almost recognized, a name. The juniper tree began to bleed. It started on the third morning of the windstorm. A thick, sticky red dripped from a crack in the bark, pooling like sap but smelling faintly of rust and brine. The birds wouldn't land in it. The cats wouldn't go near it. Even the worms in the soil beneath began crawling toward the stone wall, leaving tiny trails like veins. But the Grenshaws didn't notice. Not really, because by that morning, the house had forgotten something else. Mr. Grenshaw sat alone at the breakfast table, tapping his spoon against a cup of tea gone cold. "Funny," he muttered. "Don't remember this table being so empty." He looked at the 3 plates set across the table, his, Marlene's, and the third one was gone. Just 2 plates. His brow furrowed. He reached out, trying to picture something. Someone small, laughing, pushing a cup over by accident. But the image dissolved again, like breath on glass. When Marlene entered, he didn't look up. "We had another chair here, didn't we?" he asked quietly. Marlene stiffened. She moved to the window. Instead of answering, the tree swayed slowly outside, as if acknowledging her presence. She turned away from it. "Lottie's still asleep." Her voice trembled slightly. It was the first time she'd said something that wasn't an answer or a correction in 3 days. Mr. Grenshaw looked up. "Lottie." "Our daughter," she said. "Remember?" He stared at her. Of course. But he didn't. Lottie did not come down for breakfast. She sat on the floor in her bedroom, surrounded by crayons, none of which worked anymore. She tried pressing harder, even snapping one in half to smear the wax with her fingers, but the paper stayed white. All her colours had drained away. She looked up at the mirror. Something had written on it in steam. "He is almost gone." She rubbed her eyes. When she looked again, the mirror was clean. No steam, no letters, no reflection, just the window behind her and the tree. Later, in the kitchen, Mr. Grenshaw stood by the stove, holding a pot of stew with trembling hands. He couldn't remember making it. The scent was familiar, but distant, like something from a different life. He thought of leather, of burnt honey, of... "Who likes this stew?" he asked. Marlene didn't answer. She was at the sink, scrubbing a dish with a sponge, so fiercely it had torn through to the bone-coloured porcelain beneath. Didn't someone like this? Someone little? He was crying, though he didn't notice. Just silent tears slipping down his cheek. "I can't remember why I'm sad." Marlene stopped scrubbing. There were fingernail marks in the dish. That afternoon, Marlene returned to the spot behind the house where the juniper tree stood. It had grown again, taller now than the house, its branches like ribs stretching wide. The berries were full and glossy, almost pulsing in time with something deep underground. The earth beneath it was disturbed. A small patch of grass refused to grow, a round divot like a dent in the world. She stood there for a long time, listening. At first, nothing, then crunch. From beneath the soil, like a twig snapping. Then another. She stepped back. That night, Marlene dreamt of the boy. She did not know who he was, but in the dream, he came to her wearing a crown of juniper branches, with thorns pressing into his scalp and blood leaking into his eyes. He stood at the foot of her bed and opened his mouth, but no sound came out, only a wave of memories that poured into her like a broken dam. A child laughing in the sunlight, a yellow swing creaking, a muddy footprint on a stair, her own hand shoving something, slamming something, hiding something. A scream, then silence, then dirt. She woke up screaming. Beside her, Mr. Grenshaw didn't stir. Downstairs, Lottie had begun forgetting her own name. She sat in the corner of the hallway, whispering to herself. Over and over again, she repeated, "Lottie, Lottie, Lottie." But the word felt like something someone else had given her. It tasted foreign. She looked down at her hands and tried to count her fingers. There were too many, or maybe not enough. The numbers slipped away. Then she heard the humming, not from the tree this time, but from inside the house. It was coming from behind the cellar door. She stood. The cellar door hadn't opened in years. There were 3 locks, all rusted shut, but as Lottie approached, each one popped open with a soft, wet click. She opened the door slowly, one hand trembling at her side. Stairs led down into darkness. The air smelled thick and earthy, like mushrooms, and something older. She descended. The humming grew louder, then it shifted into a lullaby. Sleep, sleep, the wind won't know what lies beneath the roots below. The song wrapped around her like cobwebs. The temperature dropped. She counted the steps aloud to keep from panicking. 1, 2, 3. At the 7th step, the air turned warm and sticky. At the 9th, she saw something. A small figure sitting in the corner. She took one more step. 10. The figure looked up. It had no eyes. Upstairs, Marlene had begun ripping pages from the family album, photo by photo. She tore them out, shredded them, burned them in the stove. Every time she came to a picture with more than 3 people, she screamed. The boy was in all of them, sometimes hiding behind Mr. Grenshaw's coat, sometimes beside Lottie, holding her hand, sometimes alone, staring at the camera, with a face that looked too knowing. She tore out the last page and held it over the flame. Then she stopped. Her hands wouldn't move. She looked down. The photograph was of her, standing in the garden, next to the juniper tree, digging. Mr. Grenshaw had forgotten how many people lived in his house. He wandered the rooms, opening closets, drawers, cabinets, as if expecting to find someone folded up inside them. He found toys he didn't remember buying, drawings in Lottie's room that he didn't remember being hung, shoes by the door he didn't remember wearing, and in the hallway mirror he saw 4 shadows, only 2 behind him. The other 2 stood by the window, watching the tree. Down in the cellar, Lottie was still staring at the eyeless figure. It didn't move, but the humming had stopped. Instead, the room filled with a sound like breathing, deep and slow and wet. The air rippled, then the figure opened its mouth. "Don't forget me." The voice was like leaves brushing against glass. It wasn't angry, it wasn't sad, it was afraid. "He's taking me away." Lottie's hands were ice cold. "Who?" The boy stood. Now she could see the roots, growing from his back, pushing into the stone floor, cracking it. The tree. Above, the juniper tree groaned. Its bark split open in a wide, vertical grin. From it, something slid out, something pale, something boneless. It crawled back toward the house. Inside, the clocks had stopped. The air had changed. Names were becoming harder to speak, and somewhere in the walls, a small voice whispered, "I had a name once." The clocks were stuck at 3:12 a.m. It didn't matter what time it actually was outside. Inside the Grenshaw house, the hour was fixed, caught like a breath before a scream. The long hand trembled, the short hand twitched, but neither moved forward. The grandfather clock in the hallway had begun to cough out weak, broken chimes, each one sounding more like a child's moan than a bell. Marlene had stopped looking at the time altogether. Instead, she scrubbed at the kitchen floor for the 3rd time that night, fingers raw and knees aching, trying to get rid of something she couldn't name. A stain that wasn't there, but in her mind's eye she saw a trail of muddy footprints, small ones. They went from the back door to the stove, to the cellar door, and then nowhere at all. Mr. Grenshaw stood in the garden at dawn, staring at the juniper tree. It was taller than the roof now. Its trunk had grown thick and spiraled, like muscle curling inwards. The bark had split in several places, weeping sap that glistened red in the light. The branches sagged heavy with berries, deep blue, almost black. He did not remember the tree ever being planted. He didn't even remember the garden ever having room for it. It was as if the tree had eaten the pear tree that used to be there, eaten the swing, eaten something else. He walked to the base of it. The grass beneath his boots felt wrong, too soft, almost like it pulsed. Then he saw the shape beneath the roots, a bump in the soil, a soft rise, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, a grave. He staggered back. The wind rushed through the branches and whispered something faint. "Papa." He ran inside and locked the door. Lottie had stopped speaking. She lay curled in her bed, clutching her crayon box, though there was nothing left to draw. Her lips moved sometimes, like she was whispering, but no sound came out. Marlene brought her broth in a chipped porcelain cup. She placed it on the nightstand and lingered in the doorway. Lottie stared past her, not at her, through her. "I'm sorry," Marlene said. Her voice cracked. "For what I let happen." Lottie blinked slowly. "You remember him, don't you?" Marlene asked. "Your brother?" Lottie blinked again. This time, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Then she mouthed a word. "Gone." That evening, Mr. Grenshaw tore up the floorboards in the dining room. Something had scratched the underside of the wood. Tiny marks. Nails, maybe. Or fingers. There was a small wooden toy hidden there. A horse carved from pine. One ear missing. He did not know where it came from, but when he held it, he began to sob. Not loudly, not violently, just soft, quiet weeping that wouldn't stop. When Marlene found him, he was rocking back and forth on the exposed beams, whispering over and over, "I miss someone I don't remember." The cellar door would no longer stay shut. Every night they locked it, bolted it, wedged a chair under the handle. Every morning it stood wide open. On the third night, Marlene ventured down. Her candle flickered as she descended into the wet earth smell. The walls glistened with moisture. A root had burst through the ceiling and hung like a noose. In the corner, a patch of mould had spread across the stone. In the centre of it stood a child. He was pale as chalk, with dark hollows where eyes should have been. His mouth moved, but she heard no sound. Then, as she stepped closer, she saw that he wasn't standing. He was hanging, his feet just above the floor, suspended by the roots, wrapped tight around his chest. He opened his mouth again, and she heard it, a name. Her hands flew to her ears. "Stop," she whispered. "Stop it." But the name kept coming, louder and louder, until it filled the entire cellar and shook the walls. Michael. The next morning, the entire house remembered. The photographs reappeared, tacked to walls, tucked into books, pinned inside coat pockets. Toys scattered across the floor. Lottie's drawings lined the hallway again. stick figures of 4 people holding hands. 4 chairs stood at the kitchen table. A child's coat hung by the door. But the most terrifying part was that none of them had put these things there. They had simply returned, and Michael's room was open again. It was as it had been the day he vanished. Bed unmade, toy horse on the dresser, a single red marble on the floor, and on the wall, scratched deeply into the plaster, was a word. Remember, Mr. Grenshaw collapsed that afternoon. He was found in the garden, curled at the base of the tree, clutching at the dirt like it was pulling him under. His fingernails were cracked and bleeding. His lips moved in feverish whispers. "Where's my son? Where's my son? Where's my son?" He was put to bed, trembling, face grey. Lottie sat by his bedside. She did not speak, but she held his hand, and somewhere behind the wallpaper, a soft humming began again. Marlene stood alone in the kitchen. The wind had stopped. Everything was quiet now, too quiet, like the calm before something final. She looked at the knife drawer, then at the cellar door, then at the tree, whose shadow stretched long into the house. It had taken everything. She understood now. It hadn't just eaten Michael's body. It had eaten his place, his memory, his love. It had fed on forgetting, and it was still hungry. That night, Marlene went into the garden with a shovel. She dug for hours, hands blistering, eyes red, until the blade struck something solid, a box, small, wooden, roughly nailed shut. She pried it open. Inside was a child's skeleton, delicate bones, curled like he had been sleeping. Around his ribs, a woven crown of juniper branches still clung, brittle and black. She collapsed to her knees. "Michael," she said, and for the first time the wind went still. The tree made a sound, a long, deep crack, like a spine snapping. Then silence, its bark peeled like skin, curling back in dry sheets. The berries shriveled, the branches turned inward. It began to rot, quickly, violently, crumbling in on itself like a dying star. Marlene crawled away from the roots. As they blackened and curled, from deep beneath, something howled. Not a voice, not an animal, a memory, screaming as it was pulled into the earth. Inside the house, all the clocks began ticking again. Lottie blinked as if waking from a long nap. The photos remained. Michael's name was on her lips again. Mr. Grenshaw opened his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. "Where's my boy?" he whispered, and no one corrected him. But in the cellar, the mould still moved, and on the underside of the floorboards, fresh scratches began to form. The juniper tree was dead. Its trunk had collapsed inward. The bark flaked off in brittle sheets, and the once pulsing berries had shriveled into black husks that now littered the garden like dried blood clots. Marlene watched it from the kitchen window every morning, watched it refuse to decompose. Nothing grew where the tree had stood, but nothing left it either. It was as if the rot had curled in on itself, preserving something not yet finished, and inside the house, things had not truly returned to normal. They had only settled. Michael's room had begun to smell like earth. It wasn't the sweet scent of soil or the sharp tang of roots. It was old dirt, grave dirt. It clung to the bed sheets, the walls, the very air. Marlene opened the windows, scrubbed the linens, burned sage and lavender, but still the smell remained, and sometimes, when she entered the room too quickly, she thought she saw shadows sitting on the bed as if someone had just risen and left. Mr. Grenshaw didn't leave his bedroom. He was awake most days, but dazed. His thoughts came in waves. Sometimes he remembered Michael, clear and warm, with stories of toys and birthdays and laughter. Other times he stared blankly at the ceiling and muttered things that made no sense. There were 4, he whispered once to Marlene, gripping her wrist hard. But only 3 shadows. What do you mean? She asked. He shook his head. 1 is still underground, but not him. Something else. His eyes rolled back, then silence. Lottie had begun sleepwalking. She would wake in strange corners of the house, always barefoot, always with dirt under her fingernails. Once, Marlene found her standing at the top of the cellar stairs, humming the lullaby they had all forgotten. When asked what she was doing, she only said, "Michael talks to me sometimes." From under the floor, the cellar was sealed again. Marlene had nailed the door shut and dragged a dresser in front of it, but she still heard things behind it at night. A slow dragging sound, a soft tapping. Sometimes the door swelled like something behind it was breathing. And then there was the mould. No matter how often she scrubbed, it returned. It began to spread beyond the cellar now, up the hallway wall, beneath the stairs, behind the kitchen cabinet. It spread in patterns, like veins or roots, and carried with it that same damp, grave, sweet smell. Marlene traced the pattern one morning with a glove on her hand. At the centre of the mould was a shape, a face, no eyes, just an open mouth. Lottie drew again. The colours had returned to her crayons, but the drawings were wrong. They were no longer childish, no longer simple. She drew Michael over and over again. Each time his features became clearer. First his hands, then his face, then his missing eye, and always, always, roots growing from his back. She showed one to her mother without a word. In it, Michael was standing at the bottom of the cellar stairs, smiling. The village had begun whispering again. Old women at the market paused when Marlene passed. Their words came quiet, behind palms and shawls. "She looks tired. Didn't they have a little boy once? I thought he died. No, I thought he ran away." No one ever really said. No one knew the truth, but no one really wanted to ask either. It was easier not to remember, easier to let the roots keep growing. That night, it rained, not a soft, cleansing rain, but a heavy, cold one that pounded against the roof like fists. The windows wept, the floorboards moaned, and from deep beneath the house came a knocking, 3 sharp taps, then silence, then 3 more. Marlene sat upright in bed. She could hear it, faint, but there, like someone beneath the floor, knocking in 3s. She looked to her husband, who hadn't stirred, then to the hallway. Lottie stood there, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, hands by her sides. Then she opened her eyes. "I have to go down now." "No," Marlene said, rising. "No, you don't." But Lottie's feet were already moving. Marlene grabbed her and held her tight, rocking her, whispering lullabies through the girl's hair, the same songs she used to sing to both children, the ones Michael loved. "Sleep, sleep, the wind won't know." But the song had changed. Lottie joined in. "What lies beneath the roots below?" Marlene pulled away. "Where did you learn that?" "He sings it," Lottie said, "so I won't be afraid." The next morning, the mould had reached the fireplace. It climbed the bricks in neat, curling vines, more intricate than before. Now it formed letters, a message. He remembers. Do you? Mr. Grenshaw spoke that afternoon, just once, before slipping back into silence. He sat up in bed and called Marlene by her maiden name. "I buried something else," he said, not looking at her. "Not just him." She knelt beside him. "What do you mean?" "In the box," he whispered. There was more. Then his eyes rolled back, and he wept without tears. That night, the juniper tree bloomed again, not with berries, but with eyes, wet, grey, and blinking slowly in the dark. They watched the house, all of them. Marlene stood at the back door, staring at the wreckage of the tree. The soil around it had cracked. Something beneath it had begun to push upward. She thought she saw something move under the surface, too long to be human, too smooth. She stepped outside, barefoot, rain-soaked. The wind whispered again, but it didn't call her name. It called his. Back inside, Lottie opened the cellar door. The nails that once sealed it now lay in a neat row beside the dresser, as if unscrewed one by a careful, patient hand. She stepped inside. The stairs creaked. Below, something began to sing. The whispers began as soon as Marlene stepped beyond the garden gate. They were not carried on the wind this time. They came from the ground itself, from between the roots of the juniper tree, from the cracks in the garden stones, and from the black soil beneath her boots. A chittering sound, like teeth clicking in laughter, followed her down the road. She walked quickly, her coat clutched close, eyes darting to every fence post and hedge. She didn't know where she was going. Her legs moved on instinct, faster and faster, until the house was far behind her and the town centre loomed ahead like a half-remembered dream. It had rained earlier that morning. Puddles glazed the cobblestones like spilled mercury. The storefronts were still shuttered. Few people ventured out this early on a Sunday. But even with the streets nearly empty, Marlene felt pressed in on all sides. Then she saw the crow again. It stood on the fountain's edge, right where the statues of Saint Bruna and the pilgrim boy met in mid-carved embrace. Its feathers were sleeker than any natural bird's, glossy like lacquered wood. Its eye, a single one, the left, was missing, replaced by a knot of bark. She knew that bark. It matched the pattern of the tree. The bird did not fly away as she approached. Instead, it tilted its head and croaked, "Lost girl, lost boy, forgotten toys, want to play?" Marlene froze. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, like it had slithered into her skull. She looked around, but no one else was nearby. The bird hopped closer along the fountain's rim. Its claws left behind tiny scratches in the stone. A few black feathers shed from its wings, curling mid-air before crumbling into soot. "You remember him," it said, "don't you?" She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. "You remember him?" The crow leapt from the fountain and landed on the rim of a bench nearby. A small book sat there, worn leather, tied with twine. It hadn't been there a second ago. The crow pecked at the twine, undoing it. Marlene sat down, barely aware of doing so. Her fingers moved toward the book on their own. The pages inside were water-damaged and old, scrawled with crayon and childish drawings. They were hers. She flipped through pictures of her and her brother, side by side in the treehouse, blowing bubbles in the bath, laughing as they painted eggs together one Easter. Her drawings of him had no face, just a blank round head with black eyes and a half smile. It was as if even her memory had refused to render him properly, only leaving behind the shape. "You forgot him," the crow rasped, "but he didn't forget you." Back at the house, the whispers had grown louder. Vera stood in the kitchen, unmoving, staring at the cutting board. Her hand trembled. Blood slid down the side of the knife. She hadn't cut her finger, but it bled anyway. The blade wept, not her. The juniper tree could be seen through the window. It had grown another 3 inches overnight. Her husband sat at the kitchen table, reading the same page of the paper again and again. "Wasn't there someone else who lived here?" he asked aloud, eyes glazed. "Before Marlene, I mean. A boy, a cousin?" Vera turned her head slowly toward him, but said nothing. He blinked. "No, sorry, I must be thinking of a neighbour." He went back to reading. Outside, the wind picked up. The leaves of the juniper danced like flames. Something shimmered near the base, a faint distortion in the air, like heat over pavement. If you stared at it long enough, it looked like a face pressing through the bark, mouth wide, silent scream. Marlene didn't return home until dusk. The book was still in her coat pocket. She had not looked at it again. The pages made her fingers ache, like the drawings pulsed with guilt and pressure. Her thoughts were unspooling, threads snapping one by one, but she knew something was wrong. She pushed through the front door. Vera sat on the stairs, watching the light spill through the hall window. She smiled at Marlene with empty eyes. "You've been gone a long time," she said. "Where's Dad?" "Garden." "Has he said anything strange?" Vera tilted her head. "No stranger than usual. Why?" Marlene hesitated, then decided it was time. "Do you remember my brother?" Vera blinked. "Your brother?" "Yes, my little brother. He used to play with me in the attic. He had a red jumper and he loved strawberries. He carved his name into the tree outside before he..." She trailed off. "Before he what? Before he vanished? Before he died? Before Vera killed him?" Vera stood. "You've never had a brother, Marlene." "Yes, I did. You were an only child. You still are. Your father and I adopted you when you were 6. I told you that." No, that's not right. I remember him. His name was..." But the name was gone again. Her mouth refused to shape it. The pages in her coat twitched. "I think you need rest," Vera said gently, but her hand tightened on the banister, knuckles white. That night, the attic door opened on its own. Marlene had locked it. She was sure of it. But when she climbed the stairs, lantern in hand, the latch hung limp. The trapdoor was wide open. She stepped inside. The air was thick. Dust motes hung frozen in the beam of her light. Something had been disturbed, scraped across the floor. Old toys were scattered in a spiral pattern, all pointing inward to a pile of small bones. She gasped. The bones shifted. Out of the pile rose the bird again. Not just the crow, but a grotesque patchwork of feathers, wood, and toy parts. It had the doll's porcelain arm for a wing. Its tail was made of yarn. It opened its beak and sang. 1 for sorrow, 2 for pain, 3 for the boy who won't remain. Marlene stepped back. The bird continued. 4 for memory swallowed whole, 5 for the stump that bore his soul. She clutched the book. 6 for the mother with the shears, 7 for the one who feeds on fears. The attic walls cracked. Plaster fell. A shape pressed against the slats, and in the lantern light, Marlene saw the tree. It had grown through the house. Roots twisted through the foundation, and now the trunk pierced the attic floor. A hollow had formed in the bark, and within it, she saw her brother's eyes. They were not dead. They were watching. Vera stood below, frozen at the base of the stairs, staring up as the walls creaked. "Don't come down," Marlene whispered from above. "I know what you did." Vera didn't answer. Her face was a mask of fury and fear. "I know why you planted that tree. You thought it would hide him. You thought it would grow over what you did." Vera turned and fled into the night. Later, Marlene found her father asleep in the garden, curled at the base of the juniper tree. He was crying in his sleep, muttering names that didn't exist. She knelt beside him and placed the crayon book on his chest. "I remember now," she whispered. "You don't have to carry it anymore." The tree rustled. Something deep within it stirred. There was a time when the village children would laugh and chase one another down the cobbled lane past the Brackenridge house, but now they avoided it altogether, even the boldest among them. Their games grew quieter, and the laughter that once drifted over the rooftops had faded like a song whose words were forgotten. Mr. Brackenridge, thin and quiet and always distracted, had taken to walking circles in the garden. The trail around the juniper tree was worn to packed dirt. The roots of the tree lifted slightly now, as if it were stretching. He rarely went into the house any more. Inside, Miriam had grown pale, her skin drawn taut over her bones. She kept every curtain closed and every clock stopped. Her days were spent counting things, chairs, spoons, hairpins, and muttering numbers under her breath. She made tally marks on the walls in chalk, erasing and redrawing them, chasing an order that made sense only to her. There were moments, brief, unguarded ones, when her composure cracked. Sometimes, when she passed a mirror, she would flinch, not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't. No matter how long she stared, she could never remember what she looked like. It was Eloise who found the notebook. She had been digging through the attic, following the faint sound of humming. It wasn't a song exactly, just a string of mismatched notes, soft and sad. When she opened the old trunk, the noise stopped, and inside was nothing but moth-eaten blankets, an empty music box, and a small black book with no name. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but she could read them. The entries were short, sometimes only a sentence. He smiled at me today, asked if we could feed the birds together. She cut her finger on the shears and blamed him, but he was nowhere near. He told me he had dreams of a red tree with hands instead of leaves. She burned his drawings. She told him he was made of nothing, and nothing is what he'll return to. Eloise flipped to the last page. The handwriting had changed, more frantic. The words were cramped, fighting for space. He said my name, and I didn't recognize it. My own brother, my little brother. The tree is eating his name. I think it's eating mine too. If I forget him, he'll die twice. He'll die forever. There were no names, no signatures, but Eloise's hands were shaking when she closed the book, because she remembered none of this. That night, she dreamed of her brother again, but not as a boy. He was tall and impossibly thin, his limbs like stretched branches. His face was blank, with hollow shadows where eyes should be. He stood beneath the juniper tree, his arms open. Above him, the tree trembled, its leaves whispering her name. You forgot me. She tried to speak, but her mouth filled with soil. She tried to run, but roots had wrapped around her legs, pulling her downward, gently but firmly. Her arms sank next, then her chest, then her head, and before she was gone, she heard the voice again. She buried me wrong. Eloise woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. She sat up and stared at the wall where the picture of her family used to hang. The nail was still there, the shadow of the frame still etched into the wallpaper. but the picture itself, gone. Downstairs, she crept toward the back door and looked out at the garden. The tree had changed. It was red now, not just the berries, but the bark itself, stained from the roots to the highest branches, and hanging from one of the limbs was a string of small, rotted shoelaces tied together like ornaments. One pair of them was tiny, familiar. Her stomach turned. She ran to the tool shed and pulled out the shovel. She dug until her hands blistered. The earth resisted, heavy and clay thick, but she kept going. The roots made it difficult, coiling up through the soil like veins, but she hacked at them, ignoring the strange, low moans the tree made with every strike. And then she found the bones, small, fragile, packed tight under the roots as if the tree had grown down to protect them. A tiny skull with a crack along the top, a rusted button, a finger bone no thicker than a twig, and beneath the remains, an iron locket. Eloise opened it. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper, yellowed and dry. It read, "Jonah, don't forget." And with that name, Jonah, a thunderclap split her mind. Memories poured in all at once. A face, laughing with missing teeth. A soft singing voice. The way he called her Ellie. How he hid under the stairs when frightened. How he loved birds. How he always picked berries for her, even when they stained his hands. Her brother, her baby brother, and the woman who had buried him under the tree, who had murdered him, was asleep in the very same house, as if nothing had happened. Eloise didn't go inside. She sat by the bones until morning, staring at them, letting the memories rebuild themselves. The more she remembered, the more the world shifted. The house looked smaller now, the windows dull. The tree's shade didn't seem like shelter anymore. It felt like a veil. At sunrise, her father stumbled outside. "Eloise," he blinked. What are you doing out here?" She stood up, dirty and shaking. "Do you remember, Jonah?" He paused. His lips parted, but no words came. His brow furrowed. He blinked again. That's a nice name." She stepped aside and pointed to the bones. His face went white, then grey, then slack, and then he knelt. "I remember," he whispered. He had a kite, a green one. He got it stuck in the tree. I helped him." He began to cry. Inside, Miriam stood at the upstairs window. She had watched everything. As the sun rose higher, the house around her shifted. The wallpaper peeled, revealing painted-over drawings, childish birds and suns and crooked stick figures. The floorboards creaked louder now, as if relieved to finally groan. She moved to the mirror and looked again, and this time her face stared back at her, every wrinkle, every line, every tired shadow. She saw the cruelty in her own eyes. She saw the long years of denial, and she saw the red stain that had bloomed on her chest, just over her heart. It pulsed once, then again, a third time. She turned, and behind her stood a boy made of roots, and blood and bark. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. His eyes were deep hollows. He reached out. Eloise never heard Miriam scream. By the time she and her father came inside, the house was empty. Her things were still there. Her scent lingered, but Miriam herself had vanished. The mirror in her room was shattered, and on the shards was written a single word in red. Remember. In the days that followed, the bones were given a proper burial. Beneath a new marker, Jonah's name was carved into the stone, and flowers were left daily. The tree stopped growing, its bark darkened and hardened, no longer pulsing. The roots recoiled underground, but it remained, and in the quiet hours of the early evening, if one stood by it too long, the leaves would rustle in voices, not screaming, not laughter, something in between, and if you listened closely, you could hear a little boy saying softly, "I'm still here." The mornings were worse now. The house had grown almost silent. No kettle whistle, no hallway footsteps, no background hum of life. Silence had folded itself into the walls, nesting like mould behind the wallpaper. Marlene often forgot to speak aloud, and sometimes forgot she hadn't at all. The tree watched from the window, not outside, in. It was no longer limited to the garden. She had glimpsed its outline, forming in the wood grain of the bedroom door, in the twisting of her own hair in the mirror, in the black veins creeping along the corners of the ceiling like leafless roots. The boy had said he was coming, that he would make them remember, but what he did first was grow. She sat in the kitchen, clutching the porcelain sugar bowl like it was a talisman. The window beyond showed only fog and the vague silhouette of the juniper tree, now nearly the height of the house. Marlene's hands trembled, her fingernails worn down and ringless. She couldn't recall what her husband's name was today. It changed daily now. Marcus, Michael, sometimes something that didn't sound quite human. He barely spoke, barely moved, drifting through the house like an autumn leaf stuck in a draft. She turned her head sharply. A sound, not from outside, from under the floorboards. It had been happening more often, scraping like claws across the underside of the wood. Then the muffled humming of a lullaby that wasn't hers, one that didn't seem to have an end or beginning, and always that tapping. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. Marlene rose from her chair and moved to the far corner of the kitchen where the trapdoor to the old root cellar lay. It hadn't been used in years, yet now something was down there. She touched the iron handle, cold, slick. The metal was sticky, like sap. Her fingers recoiled, and when she wiped them on her apron, they came away dark red. That night, her dreams changed. She stood in a field of white stones under a red moon. The juniper tree towered above, impossibly large. Its branches formed a canopy that blocked out the stars, and each leaf shimmered with a child's name, not spoken, but understood. Then she saw the door. It was carved into the tree's trunk, just big enough for her to crawl through. On its surface was a name carved in harsh, uneven gouges. She couldn't read it. She had never learned his name. From the other side of the door came a small broken voice. "You were supposed to remember." She woke with sap clinging to her fingers again. The town had grown quieter too. Shops shuttered early, and the local church had cancelled its Sunday bells. When she asked why, no one seemed to know there had ever been bells at all. Mrs. Lintz, from across the lane, was the last to speak with her. "You look pale, dear," she'd said. "Should eat more. You've lost too much." Marlene blinked. "Lost?" Mrs. Lintz smiled too widely. "You know, wait, sleep, him." Then she blinked and seemed confused. Wait, who? She never spoke to Marlene again. By the next morning, her windows were boarded over and ivy had overtaken her yard. Marlene wasn't sure the house had ever been there at all. At the back of the linen closet, behind a stack of moth-eaten sheets, she found the box. Small, wooden, carved with birds. It rattled faintly when she moved it. Her hands shook as she opened the lid. Inside, a single grey shoelace, a button in the shape of a frog, a curl of pale reddish blonde hair tied with twine. She didn't know whose they were, but her heart screamed mine. As she looked closer, the curl of hair began to twitch, like something alive was still inside it. The house groaned, and from the hallway came that humming again, off-key, soft as breath against glass. "Come see what I've made." She followed the sound. It led her down the hallway to the linen closet again, except this time the door was gone. In its place was bark. Not painted wood or wallpaper, actual living bark, warm under her fingertips. A slit had formed in its centre, like a mouth waiting to open. When she blinked, the door was back, and she was standing in the dark. She could feel the box still in her hands, but now it was wet. She opened it again. The hair was gone, so was the button. In their place was a single small tooth, milk white and gleaming. She dropped the box and ran. That night she found a hole behind the juniper tree. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal it, a narrow trench dug into the roots, like something had climbed out of the earth, not into it. Marlene leaned closer. At the bottom of the hole, a small pile of teeth sat arranged in a circle. No dirt clung to them. They were clean, too clean. When she looked up, the tree's branches formed the silhouette of a boy hanging upside down. No rope, just tangled in the limbs, like a fruit not yet ripe. He smiled at her, mouth full of bark. "You buried me wrong." Marlene began tearing the house apart. She no longer looked for answers, only evidence that she wasn't going mad. A photograph, a birthday card, a single drawing from a child's hand. The attic gave her nothing. The bathroom cabinet was filled with toothbrushes, all adult-sized. In the basement, she found her own name scratched into the brick. in a child's messy hand, dozens of times, each one crossed out. At the bottom of the stairs, the floor had become soft, spongy, like moss. She stepped forward and heard a faint crunch. A child's finger bone stuck out from the edge of the baseboard. She stepped back. The moss pulsed. Her daughter no longer answered to her name. When Marlene tried to call her, she tilted her head and said, "You're not my mother." "Of course I am," Marlene whispered. The girl stared at her a long time, then smiled faintly. "You were." She went back to drawing. The image on the paper was a tree with a face in its trunk. It was crying. "What's that?" Marlene asked. The girl didn't look up. "It's what he'll be when he forgets everything else." Marlene reached for the paper, but the girl snatched it away. "If you take it," she said calmly, "he'll take a piece of you back." The next day, the kitchen floor was gone. In its place, bark, gnarled and glossy, like the inside of a rotten fruit. The sink had been replaced by a hollow that dripped clear sap. Inside the hollow, something pulsed, a shape, fetal and twitching, too fast to see clearly. Marlene tried to scream, but the sound came out backward. She crawled to the hallway. Every door had become a knot in wood. Her voice wouldn't work anymore, not outside her thoughts. She stumbled to the living room. It too had become part of the tree, and in the centre, he stood waiting. The boy, not dead, not alive, remembered. "You took me away. You let her." Marlene's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean to. You helped her forget me. I didn't." He stepped closer. "Then I will make you forget yourself." She woke on the floor of the hallway. The house was intact again, mostly, but everything was too clean. The girl's room was empty, and the mirrors no longer showed her reflection. There was a note on the door. "Gone to visit Grandma. She didn't have a mother. Not anymore." Marlene stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she went out to the garden. The tree was huge now, reaching far past the roof. Its leaves shimmered with faint, glowing names. She placed a hand against its bark and whispered a name she hadn't remembered until now. The tree was warm. It shuddered once beneath her touch, and somewhere deep inside, something stirred. The night was starless. No wind, no rustling of branches, just the hush of everything holding its breath. The juniper tree towered in the backyard, black against the dark. It loomed now, an impossible presence that bent the moonlight around it. Its trunk had split slightly down the middle, not from rot, but from the pressure of something within, pulsing like a second heart. Edda stood before it, barefoot in the grass, holding her drawing pad. She hadn't spoken a word all day. She no longer drew in colour. Her newest page showed the house, the tree, and a shape curled inside the roots. Round, childlike, face shaded in. Beside it, a name, Martin. That was his name. She had remembered it. The moment she'd written it, the house had groaned like it was exhaling, and the juniper branches had reached a little higher, as if stretching to touch her thoughts. Inside, Adele sobbed on the kitchen floor. She'd come undone quickly now. Mirrors refused to reflect her. Photographs rearranged themselves. Overnight, in one, she stood alone with her wedding dress. No husband, no flower girl. In another, she was holding hands with a smudge. She had tried to burn the photo album, but the fire sputtered and died the moment Martin's image disappeared. Even her reflection, when it appeared, was beginning to look less like her. Her hair would twist the wrong way, or her mouth would move when she didn't speak. Edda left the drawing on the grass and approached the tree. She reached out and touched the trunk. It was warm. The bark shifted under her fingers, not cracking or splintering, but breathing. Her hand fit perfectly into a groove in the bark, like it had been waiting for her. The moment she touched it, a whisper poured through her thoughts like wind through reeds. You remember? She did. Martin had been her brother. She had forgotten him on purpose. When she was 4 and he was 6, they had sat beneath this tree, a sapling then, and buried a box of secrets beneath it. A button, a toy soldier, a scribbled note that read, "No matter what, remember me." And then, things changed. Adele came, father got tired, the box was never found again, until now. The soil beneath the tree trembled, a smell of earth and decay rose as the roots shifted, and then she saw them, tiny bones curled in the earth, like teeth in a clenched jaw. The whispers grew louder. Inside the house, Thomas sat in the living room, blinking at the family portrait. He felt like something was missing. Didn't we used to have 2? He murmured, but the memory vanished before he could catch it. Just a wisp, like a dream that slips through your fingers the moment you wake. The door creaked open. Cold air drifted in. He didn't look up. Behind him, footsteps, small, padding across the wood. Not Edda's. Too soft, too deliberate. They stopped behind his chair. He turned around. No one was there, just the open door and the tree outside, swaying, even though the night was still. Adele had barricaded herself in the bathroom. She stared into the mirror, which now only showed the room behind her. "I'm not crazy," she whispered. "He wasn't mine. He wasn't mine." But the voice inside her head laughed. "You made him yours, and then you made him gone." A single photograph sat on the sink. It had changed again. Martin's face had returned, but he was smiling now. Not the bright, innocent smile of a child. No, it was too wide, and his eyes were too dark. He held a branch in one hand, dripping with ink, and Adele saw herself in the background, her face half erased, like the photo hadn't decided whether to keep her yet. The lights flickered. Something tapped at the bathroom door. Not knocked. Tapped. Rhythmic. Familiar. Knuckle. Pause. Knuckle. Pause. The door creaked open. Branches slithered across the tile like fingers. and the whispers rose like wind in a dead forest.
Edda stood with her hands pressed to the tree as the bark opened like a wound.
It didn't bleed, it bloomed. A hollow formed inside, just large enough for a child. She stepped in without fear. The tree closed around her. Inside, it wasn't dark. It glowed with a soft green light, as if she were standing inside a memory. The walls were lined with carvings, images of children, names, scraps of laughter, a museum of the forgotten. And in the centre, Martin. He sat cross-legged, eyes closed, mouth sewn shut with silver thread. His hands cradled a small black box, the one they had buried. When he opened his eyes, they weren't sad, they were awake. He held out the box. Edda took it. Inside were two things: the note they'd written as children, and a lock of her hair. The note now read, "When they forget you, I will remember." She pressed her hand to his forehead. "You can go now," she whispered. But Martin shook his head. His voice echoed in her mind. "It's not just me. There are more, so many more." And she saw it. Dozens of children curled in roots, nestled in memories that no longer had homes, forgotten by parents, erased by accidents, smothered by guilt, all of them clinging to the tree's warm hollow, waiting for someone to speak their names. Edda understood. This was no longer a tree. It was a graveyard of memory. And now, it was hers. Morning came slow and wet. The sky hung low over the house. Birds didn't sing. Thomas sat on the porch, staring into the yard. He didn't remember why he felt hollow. Something was missing. Someone. He heard a child's laugh from the tree. A girl. He turned. Edda sat beneath it, sketching. The tree no longer loomed. It stood gentle now. Its branches spread wide like arms. Flowers bloomed along its limbs, white with crimson centres. The grass was soft. The air was light. He smiled and went inside. In the drawing, Edda had sketched a new face among the roots. Hers, not buried, not dead, just watching. Adele was never found. The last thing anyone remembered was her screaming about mirrors that wouldn't show her. The bathroom was empty, the mirror was gone, and the family photo. It showed a father and daughter in front of a large tree. No stepmother, no boy, except in the tree's bark, when the sun hit just right, one could still see the outline of a small face, smiling, and if you leaned close, you'd hear a whisper, "I remember you."